6th of it's the fourth Thursday of November 2020, and I'm sitting down this morning to drink my second cup of coffee, and I want to conclude or do the second part of the discussion I started yesterday about decolonizing Thanksgiving. Before I do that, I want to start by acknowledging that I am speaking to you from what is now known as Washington, D.C., and that these are the lands of the Piscataway. And I want to thank the Piscataway for their stewardship of these lands. The Piscataway are the nation that they lived here, they hunted here, they farmed here, they fished here, they raised their families here and buried their dead here long before Columbus got lost at sea. And they are still here. I've been honored and humbled to meet some of the Piscataway. I've participated and seen a land acknowledgement and a welcoming to this land by the Piscataway. And I am deeply humbled to be living here, and I want to thank the Piscataway for their stewardship of these lands and acknowledge that they are still here. Yesterday, I talked about how I began to try and decolonize Thanksgiving. And my first inclination, even as I studied more of the history, and you know I've done a lot of research on the doctrine of discovery, I've done a lot of teaching about the racist and sexist and white supremacist foundations of our nation, I've talked a lot about the genocide and ethnic cleansing policies of our country, and yet I even discussed and learned about the mythological nature of Thanksgiving and how it's not even reflective of accurate history. And yet I felt I had to somehow find a way to reclaim this holiday, right? Because it's Thanksgiving. It's giving thanks. And how can you not give thanks? Like how can giving thanks be a bad thing? And I wrote a blog post in 2015 where I shared this yesterday. It's on my Twitter timeline, on my Facebook timeline. If you'd like to read it, I'll share it again later today as well. But I wrote a blog post where I talked about how I wanted to reclaim this and reframe how we give thanks and what it looked like. But as I continued studying and researching, and actually one of the huge turning points for me was when we were in the middle of writing our book, and I was uncovering some of the history regarding Abraham Lincoln. And I'll never forget the first day where I realized what a blatant white supremacist Abraham Lincoln was. I've told this story on several podcasts. I've talked about it numerous times. If you even go on to both my campaign YouTube channel and my normal YouTube channel, my Wireless Hogan YouTube channel, you'll see I've given long talks about deconstructing the mythology of Abraham Lincoln. And as I was learning about how blatant of a white supremacist Abraham Lincoln was, who didn't give a crap about Black lives, and then begin to realize how ethnic cleansing and genocidal he was, this was a huge eye-opener in my mind. And the reason it was such a huge eye-opener is because Abraham Lincoln is considered by members of both parties, by people of color and white people, to be one of the greatest presidents, to be one of the greatest presidents of in the history of our nation. And as I studied more about him, I realized that actually one of the reasons why he's considered one of our greatest presidents is because he found a way to institutionalize white supremacy and to constitutionally protect the institution of slavery so that our nation has the tools it's using to this very day to oppress, marginalize, and even kill people of color. And when you live in a colonial nation that's literally built on genocide, dehumanization, and enslavement, and it never fully gives up those practices or that behavior or even that worldview, it still maintains this understanding of white supremacy, then that taints not only the history of the country, but it taints what the nation celebrates and what the nation holds to be great or even unifying. And so I want to share with you, and so as I realized what we were doing with, literally, I'm going to call it our worship, our nation's worship of Abraham Lincoln. I realized how destructive he was, not only for the history that he enacted during his presidency, but how destructive he was because of the practices and the making the white supremacy and even slavery palatable in the 21st century, the world we're living in today. And so I want to read to you this blog post that I wrote. And I'm not sure if I'm going to, I'll probably comment on a little bit throughout it, and I'll also comment on it at the end. I'm going to share it right now on my, on the comment section of this live stream, so you can have a chance to look at it if you want. It was published on my blog. Also, Indian Z republished it in 2018 as well. And so I just shared it on a link there. And I initially titled this, Why I Declined This Opportunity for Thanksgiving. And so I want to share this with you right now, and then I'll come back in a little bit or after I read this, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. But let me read this for us. I am done. I can no longer in good conscience celebrate the national holiday known as Thanksgiving. Over the past several years, my ability to celebrate this holiday has diminished as I've learned more about the doctrine of discovery and the white supremacist, ethnic cleansing, and genocidal history of our nation. But I continue to participate because I told myself, how can you decline an opportunity for Thanksgiving? I knew the story of Thanksgiving was false. The mythological tale of a cross-cultural potluck between a group of pilgrims and their Indian hosts was merely a story perpetuated to soothe the transgenerational and communal manifestation of a complex perpetration-induced traumatic stress that is easily observed in a vast majority of white Americans. Socrates notes that the doer of injustice is more miserable than the sufferer, and I like to remind people that you cannot build a nation on 500 years of dehumanizing injustice without traumatizing yourself. But every year on the fourth Thursday in November, our family continued to gather with friends and neighbors around a turkey. Like most Americans, I grew up with this tradition, and my wife and I continued it even with our neighbors when we lived on the reservation, as well as after we moved to Washington, D.C. We did this because I continued to tell myself, and was told by my nation, how can you decline this opportunity for Thanksgiving? But no more. This past year, and I wrote this in 2018, I have learned too much and put too many pieces of our history together. On October 3rd, 1863, Abraham Lincoln gave a proclamation which declared a day of Thanksgiving on the last Thursday of November. This is the proclamation that helped establish our current tradition of Thanksgiving. And in his proclamation, he stated, and I'm quoting, the year that is drawing towards its close has been filled with the blessings of fruitful fields and healthful skies. To these bounties, which are so constantly enjoyed that we are prone to forget the source from which they came, others have been added, which are of so extraordinary a nature that they cannot fail to penetrate and soften even the heart, which is habitually insensible to the ever-watchful providence of Almighty God. Present Lincoln begins with what seems on the surface to be a standard offering of thanks. This past year has been filled with the blessings of fruitful fields and healthful skies, and he does not want to forget the source from which they came. He then goes on to note that others have been added. And this is where his Thanksgiving proclamation begins to become problematic. The others that have been added refers to the bounties of fruitful fields. He's referring to lands. Lands have been added. In February of 1863, just 8 months prior to his Thanksgiving proclamation, Abraham Lincoln personally signed a bill which nullified the treaties of the tribes in the state of Minnesota. And in March of that same year, he signed another bill which granted him the authority, without treaty or negotiation, to remove the tribes from the state of Minnesota. That removal began in April, and the Dakota, Winnebago, and other Native nations were rounded up, held prisoner at Fort Snelling, which is near the current-day Minneapolis, and then loaded onto barges, ships, and trains, and removed to the Crow Creek Reservation, which had been established in the Dakota Territories east of Minnesota. The removal itself was inhumane, and the Crow Creek Reservation was not sustainable for so many people. Both deficiencies resulted in the deaths of many Dakota and Winnebago people. His proclamation goes on. In the midst of a civil war of unequaled magnitude and severity, which has sometimes seemed to foreign states to invite and provoke their aggression, peace has been preserved with all nations, order has been maintained, the laws have been respected and obeyed, and harmony has prevailed everywhere except in the theater of military conflict, while that theater has been greatly contracted by the advancing armies and navies of the Union. Contrary to President Lincoln's proclamation, in the early 1860s, the Civil War was not the only military conflict that the U.S. was engaged in. In the fall of 1862, there was a brief but bloody war with the Dakota tribe in the state of Minnesota. At the conclusion of this war, half of the Dakota had surrendered and turned themselves in, and the other half had fled north into Canada. Those who surrendered were immediately tried in military tribunals, and 303 of them were condemned to death. But these tribunals were legal shams. As noted by historian Karl Chomsky, the evidence was sparse, the tribunal was biased, and defendants were unrepresented in unfamiliar proceedings conducted in foreign languages, in a foreign language. The authority for convening the tribunal was lacking, and more fundamentally, neither the military commission nor the reviewing authorities recognized that they were dealing with the aftermath of a war fought with a sovereign nation, and that the men who surrendered were entitled to treatment in accordance with that status. Outside the military theater of the Civil War, there was another war taking place where laws and treaties were not being respected and obeyed, and harmony had not prevailed, unless you call the hanging of the Dakota 38 and the ethnic cleansing of the Dakota and Winnebago from the state of Minnesota harmonious. Both events took place in the year for which Abraham Lincoln was proclaiming Thanksgiving. His proclamation goes on. Needful diversions of wealth and strength from the fields of peaceful industry to the national defense have not arrested the plow, the shuttle, or the ship. The axe has enlarged the borders of our settlement, and the mines, as well of iron and ore as of the precious metals, have yielded even more abundantly than heretofore. After he completed the ethnic cleansing of the state of Minnesota, President Lincoln turned his sights on the territory of New Mexico. In the fall of 1863, one of his generals, General Carleton, gave this order regarding the Navajo people in the Southwest. Henceforth, every Navajo male is to be killed or taken prisoner on sight. Say to them, go to Bosque Redondo, or we will pursue and destroy you. We will not make peace with you on any other terms. This war shall be pursued until you cease to exist or move. There can be no other talk on the subject. That's taken from the Book of the Navajo, published by Raymond Friday Locke, Holloway House Publishing in 2001. Beginning in the fall of 1863, and in accordance with the policies of the Lincoln administration, U.S. Army officer Kit Carson traversed the lands of the Southwest. He burned our homes, slaughtered our livestock, and destroyed our crops. Ultimately, he rounded up 10,000 Navajo men, women, and children who were then forcibly marched to Bosque Redondo. Hundreds died of exposure and starvation along the route, and nearly a quarter of our people died while imprisoned at this death camp. The creation of this camp was personally approved and signed off on by Abraham Lincoln. So just to be clear, in 1863, the axe did not enlarge the border of U.S. settlements. The ethnic cleansing and genocidal policies of Abraham Lincoln did. His proclamation goes on. Population has steadily increased. Notwithstanding the waste that has been made in the camp, the siege, and the battlefield, and the country rejoicing at the consciousness of augmented strength and vigor, is permitted to expect continuance of years of large increase of freedom. No human counsel hath devised, nor hath any mortal hand worked out these great things. They are the gracious gifts of the Most High God. At the start of the 19th century, the population of the United States was 5.3 million. By the end of the 19th century, the U.S. majority population had ballooned to 76.3 million. Abraham Lincoln was correct. But in all honesty, the U.S. population had not only steadily increased, but was greatly multiplying by a factor of 14. However, this stat only tells half the story. For also in the 19th century, the population of Native peoples in the U.S. plummeted from 600,000 to 237,000. For those who are keeping track, that's a decrease of 60%. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln established a national day of Thanksgiving while his own ethnic cleansing policies and wars were contributing to a genocide rate in the 19th century of over 60%. That is not only unconscionable, but akin to Adolf Hitler if Adolf Hitler declared a state of national Thanksgiving during the height of the Holocaust. So I'm done. I am no longer interested in reclaiming the U.S. holiday known as Thanksgiving. From here on, the fourth Thursday in November is set aside as a day of mourning, a day of lament. But I'm not mourning the genocide of our native peoples. I lament that travesty on other days, such as Columbus Day, the 4th of July, Memorial Day, President's Day, and Abraham Lincoln's birthday. But from now on in my calendar, the fourth Thursday in November is reserved to mourn the fact that we live in a country that in 1863 established a national holiday to give thanks for the fruits of a genocide it was actively committing. And that is an opportunity for Thanksgiving that I am both morally and spiritually obligated to decline. This is my thoughts on Thanksgiving, my thoughts on what is going on with Thanksgiving, and what we need to do about why I decline to celebrate it anymore. I know that today around our country, many people are gathering, even in defiance of health warnings by our nation regarding COVID-19. But I want to encourage people to take a deeper look, not only at the history of our nation, but why we celebrate it. And what do we need to do as a country to move forward? I just finished a presidential campaign where I had several goals in this campaign. One of the goals was to remove the racism, the sexism, and the white supremacy from our foundations. One of the goals was to build a nation where for the very first time, we the people truly meant all the people. But also one of the goals was to initiate a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. A conversation I would put on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that happened in both South Africa, Canada, and even Rwanda. I wouldn't call ours Truth and Reconciliation because that implies there was a previous harmony. I advocated we call ours Truth and Conciliation. I use this quote before my campaign, during it, and now after, that this quote used by George Erasmus when he wrote about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada that said, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If we want to build community, we have to start by creating common memory. Our nation does not have a common memory. And we are reminded of that on the 4th of July, when we celebrate a document that refers to natives as merciless Indian savages. We're reminded of that on Columbus Day, a man who claimed to have discovered a land that was already inhabited. And we're reminded of that on Thanksgiving, where this holiday was brought into the modern era by a president who was actively committing genocide and giving thanks to God for the fruits of that injustice. We do not have a common memory. We have to learn how to teach and talk about and deal with our history. And part of the steps of that is not reclaiming the holiday of Thanksgiving, but declining to celebrate it. We can find another way, another date, another opportunity to give thanks. But we first have to acknowledge that this holiday we have today is rooted in thanking God for the fruits of genocide. And we just have to decline it. Yeah, my relatives, I hope that you have a good day. I hope that you have a safe day relating with family and friends. I hope that you are able to maintain social distance. I beg of you to continue to wear masks. I ask you urgently to keep not only your own health and safety in mind, but the health of the most vulnerable in your community. Use Zoom, use other electronic ways to reach out to family and friends today and let them know that you love them and that you care for them. And use this opportunity to even help create this common memory and talk about this history. I know we're not going to make this change overnight, but this is something I'm convinced we have to do to move forward in a healthy way. Walk in beauty, my relatives, and may we learn how to walk in beauty together. I'm going to finish my second cup of coffee now. Hakone.